Hello, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdom's role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. So today I thought I would do a relatively quick video about Sim-Lite role-playing games. So this is a term I just learned like a few weeks ago. I'm sure it's been around for a while. I think it's been applied to video games before, to tabletop role-playing games. But Sim-Lite, let's break it down. So what does Sim-Lite mean? It means simulation light. And the reason I wanted to make a video about it today, just a fairly quick one, is because that is how my Savage Kingdoms game has been for the last 10.5 years. And I've always looked for a way to describe like what it is other than being medieval fantasy, even though technically it's not even that, it's Dark Ages fantasy, if you want to get historian-esque. But it is a fantasy role-playing game. But, every role-playing game, particularly, I mean, a lot of them, most of them, have some kind of more specific genre. Now not everything, but a lot of fantasy games are what we would call medieval fantasy, right? Because the fantasy genre is pretty huge, so it behooves one to break it down into subgenres. So Harry Potter, for example, is urban fantasy, also would be considered modern fantasy. Even though there's some sprinklings of medieval fantasy in there, it does not take place in the Middle Ages or the medieval era. And then you've got some games that are technically Renaissance, but you don't really hear the term Renaissance fantasy necessarily. That's usually just kind of coupled it with medieval fantasy. Then you have sword and sorcery. I did a video a couple weeks ago about the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy. Those are your two big genres. But anyway, when describing a medieval fantasy tabletop role-playing game, or any tabletop role-playing game, whether it's science fiction has its delineations as well, such as like hard tech or hard sci-fi. Then you've got lighter sci-fi, and you've got space opera, which is more like Star Wars. Exploration sci-fi. So there's a bunch of little, even like subgenres, because that genre in itself is pretty large. And in order to find a niche and to describe it more accurately to those who want to try it out or want to know what it is, you have to kind of apply different little descriptors, right? Different little subgenres, as it were. So Sim-Lite means simulation light. So when I would discover this term, I'm like, man, I could have been using this term for years, assuming it had existed for years, which it probably has. So because Savage Kingdoms in particular, my new game coming up is Red Sun, and I wouldn't quite say it's as Sim-Lite as Savage Kingdoms is. In Red Sun, I kind of took it back a little bit and made it more easier to run for a game. I mean, you can learn to run Red Sun in probably 15, 20 minutes. Whereas Savage Kingdoms takes a few more hours, actually really like several sessions to really kind of get it. And the reason why is because Savage Kingdoms, I wouldn't say it's slightly more detailed, probably is slightly more detailed than, say, Red Sun, but not really any more detailed than Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, in some ways maybe less so, but in some ways maybe slightly more so. And the reason it is somewhat complex, like on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say Savage Kingdom's complexity is like a 6.5, maybe a 7 at the most. Whereas Dungeons & Dragons is probably a 6, 6.5. I know some people say, no, it's a 10, it's a 9, 9.5. Or it's a 2 or a 1. I don't necessarily agree with that. You can think what you want. Some people say that D&D is way overcomplicated, and that's why they would say a 9 or 2. If you've seen some of the other role-playing games out there, you would know I've rated it slightly lower. But yeah, I would say it's slightly above the average complexity. And Savage Kingdoms is probably, like I said, slightly more complex or complicated than Dungeons & Dragons, but also slightly less. So I would say it's 0.5 more complicated than Dungeons & Dragons, only because it's not class-based system, although you do have the calling system, which is kind of like a class, but it's less restrictive. And so in being less restrictive means that you have to do a little more building. There's more moving parts to the game, and so it does make it more complex, although not necessarily more complicated, although the two are somewhat related often, but not always. So it does give you a few more moving parts. Red Sun is, like I said, I took it down to, it's a little more simple. There are some nice little moving parts that you have to do, but they kind of comes together a little easier. Anyway, so I'm working on the new edition of Savage Kingdoms. I'm not sure. Again, I know you guys keep seeing these videos, all 12 of you, and you're like, he keeps talking about the same thing, like which one is he going to kickstart next? And I still really haven't quite decided. I'm leaning 60% Red Sun, 40% Savage Kingdoms. I don't know. Maybe it's 55-45. I'd like to do another Savage Kingdoms, which I am. So Red Sun is about 90 to 95% complete. I think I mentioned this in the last video. If not, here it is again. And the new Savage Kingdoms edition that I am working on, it's about 85% done. 85%. So I've gone in and tweaked some stuff, right? Because third edition was the last edition. And now this new edition, which I've been calling Savage Kingdoms X or SKX, originally because it was the 10th anniversary this year, which is almost over. Thank the gods. But by the time I release it, if I even do next year, it'll be the 11th anniversary. So the X for the Roman numeral 10 doesn't make any sense anymore. So I'm now calling it, the only reason I call it XKX now is because X is now like the little, the filler, right? It's the algebraic symbol where it's like, it just kind of represents something and we don't really know. So Savage Kingdoms X is kind of the 4th edition. Because I was trying to avoid the 4th edition moniker because of the bad taste in people's mouths for Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition. I know I'm kind of getting away from that now. I think that's probably a little silly. Because even though they're both obviously in the same genre of type of game, they're totally different systems, right? They're totally different companies. So I might, in the end, I might call it Savage Kingdoms 4th edition or maybe something cleverer. I don't know. Savage Kingdoms Reborn, Respawned, Resurrected, something like that. And since I live in like Appalachian, we've gone through the whole Hurricane Helene thing. I say gone through. We're still kind of dealing with a lot of the aftermath, but it's gotten a lot better. I'm kind of almost wanting to do like a Savage Kingdoms Reborn thing. I know it's such a small game and it doesn't really matter, maybe, probably, but in my head it would kind of be an homage to what's gone on and we're kind of rising out of it, and I don't know. So let you leave some comments down below. I haven't really gotten any comments on videos in quite a while. My favorite was the Waffle House has found its king manager, which apparently that was a year or two ago. I just thought it was funny, and apparently that's a bot or somebody that leaves that comment all the time. I thought it was hilarious, although it had nothing to do with the video, naturally. So anyway, back to Sim-Lite. The only reason I went on that little semi-rant about the additions, because trust me, it all ties together. So when describing Savage Kingdoms, it is simulation light. And I learned this term, like I said, just a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago. And I'm like, oh my God, brilliant. That's precisely how I've been trying to describe Savage Kingdoms, good sirs. But because those of you who know me or have read the blurbs on the book, I sort of always say that it's billed as heroic sword and sorcery, but it's not fully sword and sorcery because there's some little bit of high fantasy elements to it. It's also set in the Dark Ages, where sword and sorcery is kind of Dark Ages-esque, but mostly antiquity world, and sometimes kind of all over, a little bit of everything, because it's not really the point. It's not really simulation. But since Savage Kingdoms, I was trying to make a historical fantasy. Is another thing. Earbud just randomly falls out of my head. So what I was trying to get at was simulation light, right? So Savage Kingdoms was meant to be historical fantasy-esque, even though it's obviously not. It's a made-up world. It's my own setting. But there are elements to, if you've read the rules, if you've played or whatever, there are definitely elements. I tried to give a pretty good bit of nod to medieval and Dark Ages history, although it's kind of spun into a fantasy setting. Like a lot of authors and world builders, a lot of us kind of take the route that Robert E. Howard did. So Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, if you've never heard of this genius, literally from Texas back in the 30s, and wrote all the Conan stories in Call and Cormac McCart and all these. Anyway, all those great pulp stories. So he originally wanted to write like historical, which he did. Like the Pictish stuff is based roughly on Pictland, Scotland, or Caledonia. But there's some elements to it because he didn't have access to tons of library books. And although a smart guy, he didn't really have quite the resources back then to do all the research. And then there wasn't really tons of research, just in the 90 years since his death, we've discovered, we as a race, as a human species, have discovered a lot more archaeological evidence, and we could put together better books about the past and stuff like that. So he was writing from a historical point of view. He wanted to, before the Hyborian Age, his Conan character, and then he decided that he did write some historical fiction. I don't think ever got published. Maybe some of the Cormac McCart ones did, but and where some of his reviewers or critics would be like, "Oh, that never happened. That was the year 794 BC, I'm afraid." So, and maybe they may have been right, and maybe they were trying to be helpful, but he was just like, you know what? Screw that. I'm not going to base it on the real world anymore. I'm going to create my own world, even though it's technically Earth 10,000 years ago, the Hyborian Age. And so he added a bunch of elements that were from actual history, which makes the world so real, and that's, most world builders use a lot of that as well. And I think that's why a lot of the worlds, such as Middle Earth and Westeros and the Hyborian Age, resonate so much, is because they are grounded in the real world, but with fantasy elements tied to it. So getting back to Sim-Lite, what does all that mean about Sim-Lite? Mike, you rambling fool. So even though that's all fantasy and that's all created, it is crafted on top of a foundation of actual things that actually happened in history, particularly in Savage Kingdom's Dark Ages history, but also early medieval history, and also back to the Age of Antiquity or the ancient world. Because my setting, kind of like the Hyborian Age, has a little bit of all of that. It's mostly, I try to make it mostly kind of like Dark Ages-esque. And that way I can give a cue to game masters as well as players when they're describing things, or if there's something not in the book. Say someone wants to buy something, they want to buy a floppy hat with a feather in it, and it's like, that's probably a Renaissance item, so maybe that probably doesn't exist in Savage Kingdoms, although you're feel free to make that exist if you want. But that should be a cue to the game master or player that, oh, this is Dark Ages, so that a rapier probably doesn't quite exist yet, although there are estocs, which is like an ancient form of rapier, a rapier. And then other things that, and there's some things that existed back in the ancient world that we always assume was a later development. But anyway, overall, describing something as a particular era of the real world, such as Dark Ages, kind of hints itself to being simulation light. And the reason it's called simulation light is because it's a lighter form. It's not sim heavy. I apologize, there's like a mower outside naturally right as I start doing the video. Sim medium, although there's parts of it that may be sim medium. So simulation light or sim light is a really kind of safe guess. And I think that's a cue, it's a good little descriptor to tell people that, look, this is a fantasy game, but we're gonna try to simulate some stuff here. We're not gonna just be all silly and run around with furry costumes on and stuff like that. Although if that's what you like, that's great. But that's my point. The game is telling you that this is, I don't want to say for real, because it's all just fantasy role-playing games. It's all make-believe. But that we're all going to kind of dial in and just kind of know that the game is a little more grounded. We're going to simulate some reality, or what we project to be possibly reality, or at least a romanticized form of reality in this game setting, whereas other game systems may not necessarily care as much, which is totally fine. So anyway, point is, Sim-Lite's a really good label, I think, for certain games, particularly Savage Kingdoms, that is trying to have some sort of form of simulation. On that note, before I end the video, since I've kind of turned this into a quasi-ad for Savage Kingdoms and maybe to some degree Red Sun, and that's fine. I need all the help I can get. The simulation light is also probably more this. I'm definitely speaking more for Savage Kingdoms. It was intended to be a little more adult, a little more. And I don't mean like it necessarily in this like sensual way or whatever, like Game of Thrones. Although there's definitely elements of that, and you can certainly include or exclude it. I run a lot of youth games, a lot of summer camp games, so obviously I exclude all of that. But it is kind of intended, to be a little hard. No, it's not ridiculously terrible. But it's intended to be a little more adult, whereas say Dungeons and Dragons can be run kind of adult-ish, but it is geared more to particularly now in like the later 5th edition and the 5.5, whatever the new edition is, it is geared more towards younger players. And so in some cases you see a little more silliness or a little more Avengers-isms, which is fine. But just know that that is its type of game, whereas Simulation Light is its type of game. So there's kind of two different things. So whenever you're a player or a game master, just know what you're signing up for. Am I playing a Sim Light game? Am I playing Sword and Sorcery? Is it Sword and Sorcery that's also Sim Light? Is it high fantasy that's also Sim Light? Or is it high fantasy that's just kind of over the top? Or is it Sword and Sorcery that's over the top? Because that can be kind of, what's it called? Gonzo. That's another little subgenre where it's just kind of a little kind of out there and crazy. There's even like science fiction elements kind of occasionally. So I'm by no means saying that Sword and Sorcery is necessarily a grittier form. It certainly lends itself to be, but it can kind of be silly, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Simulation Light also. But anyway, if you haven't checked out Savage Kingdoms and you want to know kind of what it's about, including Red Sun to a degree, if I ever release that, just kind of know what you're getting into it. It was intended, particularly Savage Kingdoms, to be a little more sim light, to simulate some stuff. That's why you have like a slightly more realistic armor system, I believe. The skill systems maybe a little more complete than some games, although less complete, certainly less complete than others. So I did, put some effort in. My playtesters that helped me out did put some effort into let's if I've ever game mastered for you, you know what I'm talking about, or if you've played the game yourself, you'll probably notice that I try to make it seem like you're in a real world, real setting. It's kind of grounded, and when you ground your world, you already do a lot of shortcut for the players. They already know, like if you say the Laurentian Empire is similar to the Roman Empire, you've already done 80% of the work for the players in their head. They already kind of know more or less what to expect, in addition to all the little elements that you have, particularly for the setting. But anyway, hopefully Sim Light is just a nice little moniker or a little label to say, hey, this is kind of a more adult game. We're going to approach it a little bit more adult, a little more seriously, but not over the top serious, of course. We're going to try to help the game master and the author here to simulate his world a little bit, and we'll all kind of be on the same page. Because remember, as a gaming group, you are a troupe. You're just like an improv troupe / acting theatrical troupe. So, all right. Well, thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully you made it this far, and talk to you guys again soon.